Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. I'm really excited today that we're joined by Siri Terjesen, and she's a great friend personally and a great friend to NDSU, and she's shared her knowledge with us for the second year in a row. Super excited to have her here for several days, and hopefully maybe again next year she'll come. But I'm also excited about her topic that she's presenting today. Every year we see those polls that come out from Gallup, and they say that young Americans are souring on capitalism. But are they really souring on capitalism, or is it cronyism that they're souring on? Maybe, I mean, I don't know if that's exactly the direction you're going, but again, I think it's going to be really super exciting. So I'm just going to read a brief bio of Dr. Terjesen. And this is a brief, it's not going to sound brief, but if you think about all the things that she's done, it's a very small part of it. So it's brief in that way. So Dr. Siri Terjesen is Associate Dean of Research and External Relations, founding Executive Director of the Madden Center for Value Creation, and Phil Smith Professor of Entrepreneurship at Florida Atlantic University, and Professor Point 2 at the Norwegian School of Economics in Bergen, Norway. Dr. Terjesen is a nationally recognized expert in higher education, strategic management, entrepreneurship, and philanthropy. She was nominated by the US President to serve as one of 15 voting directors to the National Board of Education Sciences, which advises the US Department of Education's Institute for Education Sciences. Dr. Terjesen serves as a reviewer for the European Commission's Horizon 2020 project and the Swedish and Norwegian government's higher education agencies, and also an advisor to the World Bank, Kauffman Foundation, and a variety of think tanks. Dr. Terjesen is an affiliated researcher with Catalyst in New York, Indiana University's Institute for Development Strategies, and the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, and serves on the board of Strata. And so first question is, do you ever sleep? but anyway, so I'm super excited that Siri's here today, and she'll have time for questions at the end. So please be ready with your questions at the end. And without any further delay, let's all welcome Siri Terjesen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that warm Fargo welcome. I only got to come to your great city and university about 1.5 years ago, and I've absolutely fallen in love. You have some extremely talented professors, especially in the Challey Institute. And I should highlight that we're also in a Challey theater here, but throughout the business school, engineering schools. I just love being here. So thank you so much for having me. And John brings up a great point. I think many of you are familiar with the great research coming out of Challey and the NDSU College of Business. One of them is this piece on perceptions of capitalism versus socialism. And then there are also studies by other organizations around the country where students, young people, and even sometimes older people are rejecting capitalism and preferring socialism, and in some cases, communism. So that's the starting point for this talk, because sometimes we breed that accidentally in our teaching in universities. And this article, which was published in Academy of Management Perspectives, looks at capitalism, cronyism, and management scholarship and calls for more clarity. It was co-authored with some colleagues at Baylor University and Florida State and the Copenhagen School of Business. So very quickly in the outline, let's see here. Uh-oh. Dave, you're going to have to help me on this one. Let's see. Here we go. Did I get there myself? Uh-oh. Okay, here we go. Sorry, here's our outline. We're going to talk about what is capitalism and just review that. It's a system of private ownership, coordination through markets, and decentralized decision-making. We're going to talk about these critiques of capitalism that are happening all over. In fact, if you looked at Twitter this morning, you'd probably find a few. And most of the time, they confuse capitalism with cronyism. And basically, they talk about capitalists as if these firms are trying to influence government and vice versa, but that's actually not capitalism. And basically, cronyism is antithetical to capitalism. It diverts resources, it undermines institutions, it insulates firms from actual market competition, and it discourages a lot of innovation. And we'll talk about how so much government intervention just encourages more cronyism. And every day in DC, there's a federal registrar and lots of new regulations. I'm from Florida. Our house is going to open session pretty soon. There's going to be a lot more regulations there at the state level, and those all can lead to more cronyism. And we'll make some suggestions for management research. So first, let's start with the program 10 years ago at the Academy of Management, which is the collection of all management professors like Ahmed and I and others. About 14,000 scholars belong to this organization, and the program was Questioning Capitalism, was the program for management scholars. And I'm smiling looking at Dave in our audience, who just moved here to Fargo and has an undergrad degree from MIT. And he said earlier, oh yeah, they're starting to bite the hand that feeds them. And something that we've seen. We also see books in this area. There's a recent book that's been quite popular in the US called this 99% Economy, How Democratic Socialism Can Overcome the Crisis of Capitalism. Then we have a book that's very popular in Europe by Mariana Mazzucato, Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. And then we also see this by management scholars. This is a call for papers that just finished a couple months ago in one of the top journals, Journal of Management Studies. And they were calling for articles entitled Atlas Unplugged, Reimagining the Premises and Prospects of Capitalism for Business and Society. And a few folks that I know contacted those special issue editors and said, well, are you going to be open to articles that talk about the virtues of capitalism? And they said, no. And the one thing we know as academic scholars is when you call for papers, people will write papers for that article call. And then if they don't get them into that special issue, they'll try to get them into other journal issues. So we're going to see a flood of articles supporting this viewpoint because this is the one that's published. But we can sometimes also see this in our syllabi. There's another business school a little distance from here called Harvard, and they have a lot of energy devoted to the syllabus talking about the virtues of the non-market economy, basically talking about the virtues of cronyism and conflating cronyism by calling it capitalism. Yesterday on Twitter, a gentleman called Chris Rufo, who just joined the Board of Trustees for one of the universities in Florida, called out some AACSB, which is our accrediting agency, efforts. And it's a little bit conflating, but the AACSB was saying we need to look at these capitalist corporations. He was talking about how there's close ties to colonization and he was spotlighting the focus on this. And then we also have another book that came out about vanishing corporations by a professor at Michigan. And he's talking about how corporations are going away. And one of his points is that they're becoming private because there's just so much cost of doing business publicly because there's an additional layer of regulations to deal with. But these critiques of capitalism aren't new. So 80 years ago, a fellow called Schumpeter said, capitalism stands its trial before judges who have the sentence of death in their pockets. They're going to pass it whatever the defense they may hear. The only success a victorious defense can possibly produce is a change in the indictment. But again, now the critiques are coming from inside business schools. And the point that I want to make in this article, in this presentation, is that these are, there we go. I got to get used to my clicker here. There we go. That these are really misguided. When people say firms have all this undue political influence, that's not true. Capitalism scholars for many, many years have criticized the cozy relationships with governments and politically connected firms. And then also the point is that the firm's abilities to use these political connections to secure benefits is a consequence of the government intervention itself. So when You get a big government that creates all these regulations. You basically create all these opportunities for firms to seek little favors here and there, seek favorable tax provisions, et cetera. And those could take the form of subsidies, penalties, regulations, and tax policies. And you even see that. One very good example that I think a lot of us are familiar with is Tesla, that there were just so many subsidies in this country, but also in so many other markets around the world, especially in Norway, for those electronic vehicles initially. But what is new is that management theories are encouraging this. And those of you business school students who are taking strategy, I encourage you to go back to your textbooks tonight and look at some of the careful wording in there around and guidance around how firms should manage given all these political needs. We have stakeholder theory pieces that say that firms should do all this CSR, corporate social responsibility, to garner some political influence. And we have a lot of research showing that firms that do more CSR will be more likely to perform better, get those contracts, et cetera. We also have resource-based approaches that basically treat these political actors as resources, and you seek to create dependencies and linkages to them over time. If we think about it in our classes, when we talk about the Porter 5 Forces model, which is of industry macro environment, or the Pastel model, which is of political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal influences, and the large macro environment, which could be local, regional, national, we encourage sometimes thinking to, for example, limit competition or control those laws. And that's at the essence of cronyism, especially when there are so many laws that can be controlled. So what is capitalism? Anybody want to volunteer anything from your classes? Well, first I'll point out that it was Marx who first popularized the term, and it wasn't favorably, but then other market scholars have used the term and adopted it to defend capitalism. But in all of these classic treatments by these gentlemen, by Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Schumpeter, it's that these factors of production are mostly privately owned, that the resources are mostly allocated through markets, and that individuals and groups are mostly free to engage in economic activity without some centralized control or interference from the state. And so therefore, capitalism is pro-market. In the end, there is some pro-business, but that's a byproduct of being pro-market. As I'll talk about a little bit later, cronyism is really pro-business, and it's pro those businesses that have the tightest political connections. So what we know about capitalism is that these well-functioning capitalist systems require really good institutions. And from your classes, I'm sure you can think about those important institutions. We need institutions that support production, exchange, borrowing, saving, investment, innovation, and competition. And I have some graphs here by a paper from Bjornskov and Foss, and basically they look at self-employment rates on this axis, and then they look at government size, number of government industries, and tax burden. And the more you increase the government size, the more you increase the government industries, and the more you increase the tax burden, the lower the rates of self-employment are. And I could have pulled up hundreds of other studies that would show similar results for pieces like number of new firms started, number of people thinking about starting a business, is that when the government becomes this big and there's so many regulations, then there's little incentive for folks to start entrepreneurially, and those large firms that have giant government connections are going to squash those efforts as well. We can summarize some of those tenets of economic freedom in lots of indices. This is one that's put out by the Heritage Foundation, and here, those countries that are green, bless you, like North America and Australia, and also Norway and Sweden, and Finland have some of the best institutions for economic freedom. And this is also a common misconception I've taken quite a lot of American students to Norway over the years. And before they go to Norway, they often think that it's a welfare state, that they may have been told that, but actually Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland have a very fervent capitalist economy. It is a lot, especially of private enterprises. It's a lot of private capital, but that is what is enabling those governments to spend so much on social welfare for their citizens. So this is a mark of those institutions, and generally, those places that have better economic freedom will have more entrepreneurship and innovation going forward. So there's lots of benefits of capitalism. One of them is that it's really the only form of economic organization that's compatible with natural law and individual rights. When you live under a socialist or a communist country, you give up a lot of your natural rights. Although you didn't have so many COVID-19 rules in this states and restrictions as in other states, but still, when you had those restrictions, you did lose some of your individual rights. For example, in Puerto Rico, based on your driver's license, you were restricted from, and Puerto Rico is essentially a piece of the United States, right? Restricted from going out and shopping on those days if your driver's license number wasn't even or odd for that day. So that's an example of these restrictions. They're also the best system for cultivating human virtues such as trustworthiness and thrift. And they're also best for reducing mass poverty and improving social welfare. So again, if you look at those more capitalist countries, those generally have some of the best welfare happiness and flourishing. And technically and socially, these markets, not government, are absolutely the best for using dispersed knowledge and enabling innovations that foster sustained increases in well-being and prosperity. And we have so much empirical and historical evidence for this, whether we're looking across states in the US, or we're comparing countries around the world, or we're comparing time horizons. We really see that the greatest efficiencies and the greatest maximum well-being for citizens is always in these capitalist societies. So now we have to talk about what is cronyism. Cronyism is a system in which firms receive advantages over rivals from their influence with government officials rather than a superior ability to create value for customers. So if you had two equally good firms, but one had a closer relationship with government, that firm would win the contracts, win the business, be in business 5 years from now, and this one would not flourish. It's basically rent seeking by private industry through the use of political influence. And there are all kinds of political influence. We probably tend to think of the ones that we see on the news that might have to do with Congress or the Senate, but certainly there could be political influence locally as well for contracts and so forth. And these types of political influence include business licensing and permits. So who can have a license? And depending on the state and the city you're in, you could require a license for everything from hair braiding through to, work in buildings, for example. And you could not potentially get a permit for those. Judicial and legal protections, and then all kinds of financial benefits such as tax breaks, government grants, subsidies, and loans. And one point that I'll make about government grants and subsidies that we've seen over and over again, for example, in entrepreneurship, is that when governments provide subsidies to new firms in particular areas, they sometimes cycle out the existing firms. So because they've lowered the cost of operating for those new firms, but the existing firms, which may not have political capital, their cost is going to be higher and they're going to cycle out. These are secured by lobbying government officials, donating to political campaigns, or just outright corruption such as bribes. And that's the form of cronyism we tend to hear the most about, but there's so many other types of cronyism. And then there's also nepotism, so hiring family and friends. One of my favorite examples of this is actually in France and Europe. There are these corporate boards of directors, and every single corporation is required to have, depending on the country, between 5 and 12 usually individuals on those boards. And in countries like France, where there was a quota to put more women on boards, many of the women who were appointed to those boards were married to ministers or married to other government officials. And so that was, the way that they satisfied the gender quota, but they did it by basically politicking. And those are companies that like Hermès, the luxury brand. So the nepotism hiring of friends and family can be particularly problematic, especially in countries where there aren't that many great jobs. And therefore, it's really important to get those jobs to the people who deserve them. So if we compare capitalism to cronyism, and we take what we had earlier, capitalism and cronyism have in common that the factors of production are mostly privately owned and that the resources are mostly allocated through markets. But the difference is that in capitalism, we're mostly free to engage in economic activity. But in cronyism, we're not, because there's significant interference from the state dictating who can enter the market, who can get the contracts, who can compete, whether they paid less for their goods, paid less for their rents, etc. So that's what cronyism is. And why does this exist? It exists because these government officials can control the economic resources. They've written so many laws in so many different areas that they can pick the winners. And they have huge resources that they secure through taxation. One example that we have in the state of Florida is that we have in some counties, and we're getting more of these, a sales tax for community health, which is absolutely fine for these efforts. And there are also some other types of taxes, but then the government will decide which organizations can then use that tax money, which could be billions of dollars if you add up everything that people buy in a particular county in Florida in a given year or in another county. And these regulations and laws can benefit some firms a lot more than other firms. And then you have the managers, and the managers are absolutely incentivized to cultivate their influence with government officials, improve the firm's access to resources, manipulate the information that's provided to the government in order to distort government policies in their firm's favor. So for example, they could provide a certain set of information to tell the government that we needed more of X. And then lo and behold, well, we can provide more of X. And so we see that time and time again. So really, cronyism is the byproduct of big government. That there's a lot of different types of cronyism. And this is a map from Transparency International of corruption around the globe. And the yellow countries are the least corrupt. So there we see actually in Scandinavia and Australia is doing well. But as you go redder, they become more and more corrupt. And here you can see in the US that we're no longer green like the other map and good, but there's quite a lot of corruption here, bribes and kickbacks, but there's other types of corruption too. And that can also, and some of it is considered legitimate and acceptable and other isn't. And I should point out that a lot of NDSU researchers are doing pieces on corruption, both in the US and in other countries like Colombia. So here's some other types of cronyism besides corruption. There's corporate political activity. So this is the lobbying, the campaign contributions, and other tactics to secure resources and favorable policies from government officials. There are lobbying groups in every single industry. I tend to follow the ones that are in my industry. So we have several in higher education that lobby the government for certain programs. A recent example would be doubling the amount in the Pell Grant for universities like your university and my university that are extremely affordable for students. There isn't a need for a larger Pell Grant necessarily, but for private schools, especially where the tuition is $60,000 or $80,000 a year, they would love to get Pell Grants that were much higher, because then more students might go there and they might even be able to jack up tuition even further. So there's all these lobbying activities to secure these resources and favorable policies. And then we have the revolving door. And this is really apparent in DC, where I used to live, but I think you could see it in lots of regions and states around the country, which is where influential individuals move between business and politics. So it's a former elected official and bureaucrat, and they might be appointed to the corporate board. So for example, you can look again, especially at the women, but a lot of women who are appointed to corporate boards, because there's been pressure through NASDAQ and SEC regulations, were actually former officials in the in the Obama administration in particular. Some of them came off and went into the Biden administration, but there's quite a lot of government officials. And if you unpack the bios in an annual report, you'll see a lot of those. The biggest example that people notice is that 3 of the last 8 US Treasury secretaries were actually partners at Goldman Sachs. Just one investment banking firm has provided almost half of the secretaries of Treasury over the last few years. And you can imagine that those policies would be shaped a lot by their experiences. And then you've got people serving and then going right back into their corporations afterwards. Many studies in this area. A meta-analysis, which is where you add up all the studies and look at the effect sizes, shows that government policies are more likely to favor firms that engage in certain forms of corporate political activity. In other words, all of this pays off. And you can see the size of the lobbying efforts. I didn't want to flag anyone in particular, but if you look online, you can see what those lobbyist groups are and who they targeted with the most money. This is generally public information, although it's not necessarily there are some ways that you can hide it a little bit, and there's a massive revolving door. So this is just the 2017 to 2019 class from Senate and Congress, but all of these individuals who didn't return to government went into corporations. And you can imagine that they are making a lot of deals happen because they still know quite a lot of people in the Congress. They know how things work. They can get in there and create more favorable situations for some players over other players. Very happening in the US, but I also want to point out that it happens in other countries around the world. As you saw in that corruption index, the darker orange and the red countries were in other places around the world. And one of them is in Asia. So if you think back to the Vietnam War, World War II, total devastation of economies, and countries really wanted to rebuild. And it's natural for them, Cambodia, our colleague, to think, okay, well, we need some government push to get behind certain industries and prioritize them. Absolutely understandable. But sometimes, and quite often, this big push for industrial policies to foster this industrialization funneled lots of resources to some firms for tax policies, government subsidies, lower zero interest loans, lots of protectionist policies. So you'll see a lot of import restrictions. So their import quotas that wouldn't allow them to buy goods from the US or from other countries. And what happened in Japan and Korea, and the business school students, you probably have seen this in your international business textbooks, is that this created these networks of firms. In Japan, they're called kairetsus. In Korea, they're called chaebols. There's some pictures of all the Korean chaebols over here on the right side of the slide. And the Japanese picture just shows all the interrelationships between different companies that are with Toyota. So instead of going into the market like what we had in the US, and we still have in the US in the automobile industry, where you can have a lot of players, and a little bit this part of the country, but especially the part of the country where I'm from, Ohio, have all these little players that are making pieces for automobiles, accessories, et cetera, and selling those into them. That doesn't exist there. All of them are companies that are just basically one giant company, and they have all these internal transaction costs. So you get these big companies, and sometimes they're quite effective. There's a lot of pretty good Korean firms on this slide and pretty good Japanese firms, but sometimes they aren't effective. And we see that these firms just talk too much to each other. They're not used to being in the real market. The quality of their goods is not there. And then a really, really, really horrendous effect of all of this is that people think that they can't start businesses, and people don't start businesses because you have these absolutely ginormous firms that do everything practically in these countries, that if you're, like so many of you in this room, a young person who might want to start a business, there's no role for you because those large firms will create some policies that will, there we go, yeah, destroy them. And this is a slide up here from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor entrepreneurship data, and we're separating countries by level of development. So these are the least developed countries like India and Egypt and Sudan. These are the, we call them transitioning countries, Poland, Turkey, Uruguay, Oman, and then these are the most developed countries. And so here we have Japan is where my arrow is. So these are the most developed countries in the world with all these great resources. And this is the percent of adults aged 18 to 64 who might someday who plan to start a business in the next 3 years. And if you look at that, it's less than 3% of adults in Japan would want to start a business in the next 3 years. And if I showed the data on new business startups in Japan and Korea per year, number of people who've actually started a business, this is just intentions, those numbers are also 1, 2, 3%. It's devastatingly low, which means that there isn't a lot of innovation and new companies coming into those economies. Instead, it's just these big, bloated, government-linked chaebols and kairetsus that are running the show. And I'll show you that on the next slide. So when you have these large politically connected firms, they oppose the emergence of innovative startups. And not only will they try to stop you, but they'll also psychologically tell you, that's why those optimism and interest levels are so low. You shouldn't do this. And then when those firms fail, boy, do they fail hard. So this is the Asian financial crisis. Bunch of countries with firms like this that were heavily cronyist. Yeah, we're smiling. Our Cambodian professor, John, he's smiling. -10 performance during the Asian financial crisis. GDPs were down so hard relative to all the other economies. It was really an Asia effect. And that was because there were these close ties between government and business, and that delayed regulatory reforms. There were tons of bribery scandals, criminal indictments, and just an absolute failure of these government firms. And then there wasn't another section of firms that weren't government tied to rely on because they'd all been driven out of business. So the greater the dependence between firms and governments, the greater these governance and resource allocation decisions are politicized. And that becomes, in many ways, the first things people think about. I have to say it, when we teach, as I do, Pastel, that framework of macro environment, we start with political and we end with some of the legislative pieces and legal pieces. So we're basically bookending all the other analyses by looking at how we can influence these governments. So there's lots of ways that cronyism reduces social welfare. The first is obviously we could divert this capital to far more productive uses. So just had a bunch of congressional campaigns. On average, each congressional candidate spent over $12 million. And you can look at some of them and they spent absolutely exorbitant amounts of money. And the amounts that people spend on these congressional races has increased 175% since 2010 and shows no sign of slowing down. So you can think of all the ways that that money could have been more productively used. It's created substantial indirect costs to build the institutions to prevent, monitor, prosecute cronyism. And there are substantial costs, not only in time, but also in resources and mental space here. So we've got the UN Convention Against Corruption, the EU Anti-Corruption Convention, and all of these costs are ultimately borne by taxpayers around the world. So if you've created a system with cronyism, which is the main argument, we shouldn't have that, then you do need these agencies, but boy, are they expensive to create and maintain. And then it really just undermines the impartiality of economic and legal institutions. So you have these politically connected firms that are getting better government contracts, grants, loans, and other financial resources, and they favor large firms in particular. One example of this that I've studied has been the board gender quota in Spain. So in 2007, the then King of Spain, Juan, said, well, we're going to have a rule that X% of public firms have women on boards. Other countries had sanctions, like in Norway, where they would throw those firms off the stock market, or some of those firms would actually delist and go private. But in Spain, they didn't set a sanction like that. The only sanction they set is, if you don't comply, you'll be less likely to get government contracts. And in a country like Spain, government contracts are like about 20% of the GDP. So you really need those in lots and lots and lots of different industries in Spain, because you want to do the accounting for them, you want to do the construction, you want to do the manufacturing. So what we found in this research, which was 7 years of data and tracking who won those contracts, is that the more they complied with this regulation, the more likely they were to get those government contracts. And we could probably look at that now and see whether those firms were also more likely to survive compared to other firms in the same industry code. So it's pretty serious stuff. It also reduces the overall effectiveness of institutions, because it just incentivizes government officials to create more regulations. And sometimes it reduces the transparency because people try to hide those. So the solution to one regulation may then be a set of regulations. Now, there have periodically been administrations where the president might say, well, for every new regulation, we're going to peel back two. But I don't know of anyone who's actually succeeded in that. Instead, it's like, oh, well, they found a workaround, so we're going to need another regulation in there. And it becomes incredibly time consuming in lots of industries to stay on top of that. It also requires that your firm, probably, depending on the size, but large firms for sure have someone internally who does government affairs. And then externally, they will have someone that not only will they spend resources on an industry association, but they also might have a separate lobbyist in DC working on their behalf. The best analogy I could use for this is, have you ever been in a doctor's office and you see all those pharmaceutical reps that are trying to get in there in between patients or bring lunch to the doctors to talk about a drug? It's kind of like that. You've got a lot of lobbyists when you're in DC walking around trying to get in there to talk to the politicians on behalf of companies. It also diminishes the overall macroeconomic outcomes that can create vicious cycles that stunt economic development. If you spend a disproportionate and unnecessary amount of your time on those bureaucracies, you're going to have lower labor productivity, and you're just going to be focused on regulations rather than on just building the best product or service for your customers. And there's lots of social problems from these ineffective governments. You have inadequate access to safe water, malnutrition, poor health care. I dare say that I'm from an area that's about an hour outside of East Palestine, Ohio. And I just think something's up there because we have so many people who are so sick, and we have not a lot of action now, several weeks in, and we could and those people don't right now have access to safe drinking water. I don't think a lot of them feel safe in their own homes, and I think that some of that may be due to crony relationships between the firms involved and the national government, not necessarily the local environment. So does our management research sometimes increase cronyism? I think that there are certainly examples. We're always pushing theories of performance and how managers can get better. And one way is to control some of these political outcomes. So I think that that's absolutely the subject of management scholarship. We've got a lot of language in these textbooks and case studies, and we have discussions about how to maximize self-interest and goal misalignment. And therefore, we might have managers who are acting a little bit more opportunistically. And then we do have a whole body of CSR and stakeholder theories, and some of that's really good. But some of that promotes public-private cooperation. It's also fine, but not when those politically connected firms are getting all of that and not the new firms. So to keep cronyism at bay, there's lots of future research directions. We could try to understand what conditions a capitalist economy can function without cronyism. We could look at potential mechanisms that would keep business leaders and government leaders more accountable. So keep the business leaders from seeking those political privilege, whether there's a role of new organizations, such as a roundtable of business leaders that would commit not to engage in any of these cronyism policies. From a comparative capitalism perspective, we could look at whether certain countries have retained capitalist features, but avoided cronyism. And we can also wonder, how can individuals who are simultaneously working in business and government then bring some of the best of business to government and make those governments more efficient and accountable? So thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to your questions. Yes.
One question for capitalism is interest policy. You say that is not there is not a problem with capitalism.
Thank you. So the question is, to repeat it for those on Zoom, one critique is that capitalism creates inequality of individuals. And to that, I would say, and I live and work in South Florida, where half of our students are either first generation or second generation coming to this country. Some of them even on the boats that I sometimes find it on our beach. They're migrants. And what they tell us is that in Cuba and Venezuela, and now Colombia has become quite communist, they would never have the chance to move up, that those government positions and those corporate and good companies were owned. And so they came to America and they did that. And I think even as you look, like, for example, here we are in the Challey room, and Bob Challey, I believe, is an incredibly self-made individual, that he started his life like most of us. Carrie and I are both from Ohio. You guys are from North Dakota, but some would say that, the best fortune you can have, is just to be born to good parents, or just to be born for this chance for this relatively low price education here at North Dakota State. And from there, you can go so many places. So I think that in a country where there's a true market and people can compete, then anyone can advance. There may be inequalities, but the market can also help to address those inequalities. So for example, where I'm from, although we have some government-funded homeless shelters and other efforts, it's been actually the private citizens and capitalists who've set up some of the best facilities for youth education, homelessness, rehabilitating drug folks at a cost that they bear. So unfortunately, there are inequalities everywhere, but I should also point out that the difference in inequality in this country, it's gotten a lot better for everyone in this country with more capitalism and more market trade. Thank you. Yes.
Siri, so we gave a lot of money to businesses during the pandemic, and maybe this is a conversation that we can continue
as an anecdote, I get meal delivery kits, and the place that I go through suddenly shut their doors this week. They've received significant money from the Finger Lakes Development Region, and my impression is that they overexpanded because of artificial demand, which if they would have just been on their typical expansion path, they probably would still be in business today. I know it's still too early for us to really assess the impact of these government programs to get businesses through the pandemic, but I wonder if you have any insight over how businesses maybe ultimately that receive some of this money are going to negatively be impacted in the long run as a result of them receiving the money in the short run.
Okay, thank you. So to summarize, lots of businesses in this country got lots of money in the COVID-19 PPP and also just increased business. And what are some of the negative impacts of that, including the story of your meal delivery company here in Fargo, where you're a customer? Oh, Finger Lakes. Okay. So this is, you know, there's so much horrible stuff about COVID-19, but then occasionally there's some silver linings because it provides a almost perfect test of markets before and after. So as researchers, we used to truncate the data based on something else, sometimes the recession, and you know, we've had about 9 recessions over the last 100 years, but COVID-19, you know, flipped the script and changed so many assumptions. And so it became like this perfect test, or we would call perfect experiment. So the negative impact is real because you have so many more dollars flowing into these businesses. Sometimes it was to buy the goods and services for someone else. Sometimes it was just loans, right? And people may or may not have provided PPP information. By the way, even with the PPP loans, as far as where I'm from, some of those loans were processed faster by going to certain firms over other firms. So that created a little bit of a weird piece, because certainly there were lots of people who deserved these loans, but if some firms could get them faster than other firms, then the firms that didn't get them as fast might have to do layoffs or not pay people. During the pandemic, I talked to lots of business owners, and the bar that the economics and business faculty like to go to suffered because they didn't get their PPP loans, and they really did have dishwashers and cooks and bartenders who were out of work for several weeks. Then it also, for those that get money, it lowers, it's not only more capital, but sometimes it was tax breaks, et cetera, on the goods sold. So technically they had more profit than those who didn't have it. Now there were a few firms and even nonprofit organizations that took a stand against big government and wouldn't take those loans. There were a few think tanks in DC that did that. And of course, by not taking that money, it certainly increased their costs, but they could go to their typical sources of funding, individual and private foundations, and ask for more money to cover the difference, which they definitely did. Thank you. Anything else? Yes.
A lot of this conclusions came to the socialism would eventually make the event that the capitalist system comes in democracy. So what can we do as a society to promote these ideas, to ensure that democracy continues to have a sustainable future for all?
Thank you. That's a great question. So a well-read student of Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, and the point that we may eventually slide into socialism, and what can we do about it? I really appreciate that question. It wasn't one I was thinking about when I was in college, but it is now. I think we have to talk about these issues. I think we have to confront things head on and for example, with this paper say, oh, come on, guys, I know you're also professors in other universities, but you are conflating cronyism and you're calling that capitalism, and you're poorly educating your students. I think we need to have lots of opportunities to observe this. So I love your university. I love Fargo, and you can get so much great experience here. If you can also go to Washington, DC, or other places, or people from other places can travel here and can see the virtues of capitalism. I think that's important. I have a trustee at my university who wants to send all the students who love communism to a communist country for a week, and she says she'll pay for it. But you know, that's probably safety-wise not going to be a good example. What I love is that there's a whole network of organizations across this country that will do that. So Foundation for Economic Education has conferences they'll bring students to. The Fund for American Studies has some great opportunities. There's the Abigail Adams Institute that's attached to Harvard, where students can apply and go for free. There's American Institute for Economic Research that's in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where students can go. You can present papers with the Association of Private Enterprise Education. You can go to Institute for Humane Studies and Mercatus events. There's a lot of ways to get exposed to this by traveling. And then if you can't travel, then also by Zoom. And then I think it's important to live those values, right? So if you're going to take a stand against cronyism, then you can't engage in cronyism. And if you have, you know, you can also be a voice for this. So when the Chali Institute does its next survey and talks about these and other issues, and you see these results and you want to say something in an op-ed, I think that's important. I think the other piece that's important is just being the engines of the future. So there was a young man in the UK who was pretty upset about all of this 80 years ago. At the same time, Schumpeter was complaining, and he and some others were setting up the Mont Pelerin Society. There was a gentleman called Tony Smith, I think, in the UK. And the advice he got was, well, you can work in the think tanks on this area, or you can just start a really great business and show people that. And that's what he did. And then he started some other businesses, and then he ended up creating quite a network of that. So I think it's important to engage and take it up front and be a voice for that. And for researchers, we should take on these issues, because these cronyist policies are really not going to make a wonderful world to live in. Yes.
It's like that base content. So a lot of have to say that cronyism isn't real capitalism, and then socialists could say a lot of the bad examples that capitalists use that would be not real examples of socialism and communism. How does one address the flaws of capitalism without adopting the flaws of socialism?
Okay, so how does one address the flaws of capitalism without and acknowledge some flaws around socialism and communism? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like no.
Right, perfect. And we didn't talk about varieties of capitalism, that there's an awful lot of different varieties. We have the system in the US and the UK, and then Scandinavians have a little bit more welfare, and then there's other capitalists. But I would say with socialism and communism, there is a general comfort for a greater amount of government. And when you get greater amounts of government, you get greater amounts of governments making decisions about who does the work and what the quality of the work is. So I think it's probably not the best way to explain it, but I think that in socialism and communism, you have far more government involvement and intervention and cronyism. But there would be examples of socialism that we might use that certainly don't involve cronyism. But I think we have to look at the layer of pieces. I also think it's important to look at these pieces in fabulous detail. So although I threw up a tweet yesterday from Chris Rufo at the beginning, you know, we can't possibly begin to address these issues in a tweet or even in, you know, strings of tweets. And we have to kind of look in detail at the case study. And sometimes we need to look at it over time to the point earlier that, you know, some of these COVID-19 policies may have seemed to make a lot of sense at the time, but then in retrospect, oh my gosh. And I think that's important too. Thank you. Yes, Dave.
I suggest that based on your presentation, two of the challenges that politicians and bureaucrats. A potential solution for the first group is term limits. Minimize the amount of time they have to strengthen their ability to provide benefits in cronyism. Thoughts?
Okay, thank you. So Dave's asking, seems like there's two challenges, politicians and bureaucrats. And so one solution for politicians would be term limits. And it was interesting. I was looking at this the other day to see whether the term limits in the US were substantially different from many other countries, because obviously there are some governments around the world with basically near permanent leadership. But for the most part, there are term limits in democratic countries that are similar to ours. I think the issue with term limits is that even if you're in and then you're out, you can still have a bit of a revolving door, because then you can go after something else with term limits. So for example, you might be on the city council, and then you might be on the county commission, and then you might run for your state house, and then you might run for your state senate, and then you might run for the US House or the US Senate, or you might become that, you know, there are secretaries of agriculture and other roles, secretaries of education. So even though there are term limits, boy, there's an awful lot of people who've been in the system. And one example I can think of is Governor DeWine in the US. I remember seeing him in an amphitheater like this when I was 16 years old and in Buckeye Girls State. And now it's 31 years later, and he's still a politician. And so no matter what we do, now politicians could maybe, you know, behave more like stateswomen and statesmen and not be cronyist. And I think that would be okay. But in general, I do favor term limits. And I think the other issue we have with that, we certainly have in Florida right now, is whether if you run for one office, do you need to resign from the office that you're currently in? And that's being debated in Florida and lots of other states and countries around the world. And that's certainly up for discussion, because at the city level, we have that rule where I live. If you're a city council person and you run for a state house, you have to resign. But then if you don't get elected, which was the case in my community, you know, then that individual who is a politician needs to find something else, lost the career tournament model. So I think it's kind of interesting. Let's see. Yes.
They could potentially argue that the cronyism helped them like jump very quickly. That's like they had the quickest jumps from third world to first world, and a lot of it is based off the state. Saying Samsung, LG, you have to create technology, you can't just do special textiles and stuff. How does one now address, since they're now more mature and want to move out of emerging market status? How do they like address that cronyism that is probably now more damaging than just like?
Good question. So in Korea, these policies helped them create an economy and great companies like Samsung. But what's next? Because now they're competing on a global stage. They're competing against lots of firms, in lots of different countries. I think that'll be really interesting. There are examples of some firms, actually even from China, where they encourage so much competition inside the firm, like at Hire, that, for example, if you wanted something done in the firm, you could go to 3 or more business units and then decide which business unit was going to do that. And that creates more efficient organizations. Not saying that's optimal, but that's certainly some consideration. And then the question is, how long can these subsidies continue? And we don't know the answer to that. If you're following airlines and if you're trying to get to India or Asia, you have a lot of US national carriers that will get you there, like United. Then you have some other national carriers like Lufthansa. And then you have some absolutely state subsidized carriers like Emirates that will get you there as well. And so, we don't know how long those subsidies can continue, but I think that's a good example where the state can continue to subsidize in certain countries and certain industries. Whether the Korean government will continue to do this long term, we don't know. But I think it's a good question about how they can become better and offer better goods and services without the government connections.